So not unlike the law of demand, law of supply, again, it's the relationship of price to the quantity. Price, quantity, price being the y-axis, quantity being along the x-axis, along the horizontal axis versus the vertical axis where the price axis is at. And where in demand, we were looking at an inverse relationship in quantity supplied, or in supply rather. What we're looking at is a supply curve where the price, there's a positive relationship. Positive relationship meaning as price goes up from price 1 to price 2, quantity increases as well. So there's a positive relationship. Price goes up and quantity goes up. And similar to the law, or just like the law of demand, movement, you're talking about movement along the supply curve. That's the change in the quantity supplied. And 99% of the time, supply curves are positive in nature, moving upward and to the right. Again, as price increases, quantity supplied increases. And movement along the curve along the supply curve, relates to the quantity supplied. So as the price goes up, quantity supplied always changes, okay? Versus a change in supply. Change in supply speaks to the overall supply changing, shifting from, from this point, supply 1 to supply 2, or vice versa. So moving from supply 1 to supply 2 would be an increase in supply. So increasing supply, or decreasing supply for that matter, you'll notice that the price can be the same. So if price is the same, it's not always the case, but this is just to illustrate again. So if the price is the same and you have two different quantities supplied, points of quantity supplied, you would have a shift in supply, whether inward or outward. So again, this is kind of an illustration on how supply looks. And so the question comes as, similar to demand. What would cause a change in supply? What could cause the supply to shift from supply 1 to supply 2? So increase. What could cause it to increase or to decrease? Doesn't matter. There are a variety of different things. One would be, again, irrespective of price. In the law of supply, this is just speaking to price, quantity supplied. Over here, we're talking about an entire shift in supply. And in this case, would be like the price of inputs, for example. If the price of inputs went down, then the supply could increase. So let's just say, for example, the cost of gasoline. The input for gasoline would be crude oil, of course. And what's happened over the course of the last few years is that fracking, which is horizontal drilling, so on and so forth, there's been much more an increase in the supply of crude oil into the pipeline, if you will, and going toward gasoline, where it goes to the refinery and they, certain percentage of it turns into gasoline. They can transform it into gasoline. So in that case, the input for gasoline would be crude oil. An increase in the amount of crude oil increases the supply of gasoline, shifts the curve over to the right. Anyway, you got the idea. Other things would be technological improvements, and it's kind of redundant to say that, because anytime you add technology, the theory behind it, of course, is that you're going to improve the process, reduce your costs, so on and so forth. Increased number of sellers. If you have competition rolling into the mix, it would again increase the supply from supply 1 to supply 2. A decrease in suppliers and competitors could reduce it from supply 2 to supply 1. Also, expectation of future prices. If you expect prices to go up in the future, that could also bring more supply into the picture. And as the same goes for a couple of government intervention type situations. One would be taxes or subsidies, and the other would be government restrictions. Subsidies, basically what that means is that it would increase the amount supplied, because the farmers in this case will be looking at an agricultural subsidy, would be guaranteed a certain price, so they would increase the supply. They're selling more goods and services. Anyway, that's it for supply. Again, very similar differences, but very similar to demand. Of course, it's flipped around.